Hi everyone, how's it going? In the last video I showed you the whole painting and weathering process of the Jagdpainter in 7-second scale. As I said before, I want to make a small diorama for it, so in this video you will see how I figure out the figures. The 7-second scale figures. There are plenty of them, but usually it's difficult to find good poses that fit in our objectives or expectations. Moreover, using figures from different manufacturers in the same scene may be weird, as the dimensions and proportions vary quite a lot between them. We always can make some modifications to reach a specific pose, but sometimes it's just not possible. So for this project I decided to make my own figures from scratch. So let's start. Human body has a key proportion parameter called cranial unit, which range from top to bottom of the cranium, or the bottom of the nose. For scale purpose, I've used 2 mm for this dimension. So from top of the head to the pit of neck there are 2 cranial units. The torso comprises 4 more units from pit of neck to the base of ischial bone. The thigh is 1 unit to the side of the spine, then 3 units from top of femur to center of knee, and 3 more units from knee to heels. The shoulders are around 1.5 units from the spine, then 2 units to the elbow and 2 more to the hands. In the end, following these proportions, the figure in 7-second scale will have around 24 mm height, which represents a human around 1.73 meters tall. So, starting from the wire armature, I use a piece of 0.8 mm steel wire with around 9 cm length. First step is to bend it in half, making it as tight as possible. The first 4 mm will be the head and the neck. From this point I twisted the wire the length of the torso. At the 12 mm mark, I bent the wires on the hip line. Choose a sturdy material for the wire. It will be more difficult to bend and to create the armature. However, it will hold the final pose while sculpting, and this is quite important, believe me. Furthermore, even small length mistakes will result weird looking figures in this scale, so keep checking dimensions is a good measure to achieve good proportions. A marker is a good tool to help define the bending points, like knees, heels, shoulders and elbows, and you probably will find it easier to measure and mark these points before bending the wire. I made a 90 degrees turns on the heels to make the fit. I left the feet with 2 mm length, bent the wires again and used the leftover wire for holding purpose. The feet could actually be a little longer, as you will see later. A small bend was made on the knee to mark its position. The arms were made with a second piece of wire. I just made a small circle to embrace the pit of neck point. I used a drop of black superglue to hold it in place. After it dried, I marked the bending points and repeated the same process used with the lower limbs. After the armature is basically done, with all bending points well defined, it's time to prepare the pose. This one will be sitting on the gunner's hatch, with one leg inside the tank and the other hanging outside. It's important to make the pose and test fit on your model to avoid further surprises. This chewed gum man is the commander, I took a slightly different approach, more on that later. The third figure will be a crew member walking outside. To increase the sculpting material grip, I wrapped the armature with a 0.02 mm copper wire around the limbs. The torso is already a twisted wire, so there's no need to do it there. Then I scrubbed the armature with alcohol and a stiff brush to clean it. I tried a few different sculpting materials, like air drying clays and epoxy putties, but without good results. So I bought the Super Sculpey clay, which is the ones you have to bake it to get it dry and hard. It kind of dries in air, but you can reactivate it by adding this clay softener and kneading until the cracks disappear. Adding the clay to the armature is quite tricky. I started using a drop of black super glue on the feet, placing small amounts of clay around it and gently pressing it with my fingers. When you get a certain amount of clay on the armature, it starts to adhere better. However, if you notice, I didn't use super glue on the legs, which was a big mistake. So, my advice here is to glue the first layer of clay to ensure its grip. After completing the first layer of clay over the armatures, I used my homemade holder to avoid handling the figures and potentially jeopardizing the next steps. Now you can start adding more and more clay to increase volume. When you add the pieces of clay, it's important to blend it with the tool, rolling it over until you get a homogeneous appearance. I'm using this sculpting tool that looks like a needle, but you can actually use a toothpick as well. When I get the desired thickness, I start pressing the pointy end of this needle to create the wrinkles on the pants. This process is quite fun actually, and you can erase and start it over quite easily if you don't like the results. Here's not the so fun part. Remember when I didn't glue the clay on the armature? Well, this is the outcome. So remember, the glue. Clay won't stick on the wire by itself. The way I'm talking, you may be thinking that I made tons of figures, but the reality is that I didn't. As a matter of fact, I made 3 figures prior to these ones, and only one that I actually used. So I'm still a learner. And why I decided to sculpt instead of using 3D printed figures? Well, I don't have a 3D printer, and also would have to learn how to operate it, build the 3D models and so on. And buying some of them would be expensive and would take a lot of time until it arrives at my doormat, if they do. Sculpting always amazed me, and I decided to try and increase my modeling skills. Of course, the outcome will not be as good as the resin or 3D printed ones, but if I keep practicing, maybe my figures will be good enough. It is just like the relation between scratch build and aftermarket products. I'm not saying that I won't use 3D printed figures, but as I didn't find the pose I want to this diorama, I found this to be the best way right now. Okay, enough of disclaimers, and back to the sculpting. For this particular figure I decided to make it with rolled up sleeves, because of the part this figure will take on the diorama. The problem is that the wire I use is a bit too thick for this matter, and guess what? The arms got too thick too. And as a friend pointed out, they just look like Popeyes. Anyway, one decisive feature that made me choose this clay is that it gives you plenty of time to sculpt, no rush, as would happen with epoxy or air drying ones. It holds all engraving and forms you add to the figure. You just need to be careful to not touch it while sculpting, even after some days of work. It will only get hard after some baking, so to save your progress you can bake it and then keep working on other areas, as I'm going to do with the heads. However, as this clay doesn't stick quite well to surface, as you saw earlier, if you want to add new layers you will have to glue it to ensure it won't peel off later. Another advantage of sculpting is that you can press your figure in place while the clay is not hardened, to give a more natural contact look, as I made with the gunner. As I said before, I'm not an expert, but after a short sculpting time I realized that using thick layers of clay around a thin wire may cause some problem, as the wire area, which provides structural strength, is quite small. If you use too much strength to sculpt far from the wire, you can rip off the clay, ruining everything. To deal with this issue, you can add a layer of epoxy putty prior to the clay, as I made with the chilled looking Commander. However, I added it in the whole figure, which is not the best approach because you can end up losing proportions by making the figure limbs too thick. When satisfied with the result, you can gently brush isopropyl alcohol over the figure to smooth some rough areas and details. To bake the figures, I just placed them on a tray, set my oven for 50 Celsius degrees and 15 minutes. Be careful to not over-bake it, as the clay layers are thin, too much heat may crack it. Okay then, moving to the hats. The procedure is the same as shown before. First, glue the clay on the wire and start to slowly increase the volume. The head shape is a bit tricky, so keep taking some measurements while adding clay is a good way to keep the proportions. Now that I got the dimensions I wanted, I start to build the face by the eyes, gently pressing the point end of the tool to create depressions and then dragging it to the side of the head, making a smooth transition. To make the nose and mouth, I add a small amount of clay, and with a blade I made a cut to separate the lips. Ears and hair were made in the same manner. The head is one place that I should use the first layer of epoxy putty, because it got a little unstable while adding all the details, as the clay layer got too thick. Here's the completed figure, already baked. I think it got pretty nice. And this is the chewed gum commander, after a nice clay treatment. The commander was the first figure of the three, and I made the hands and binoculars separately, to superglue them later. Keep in mind that even after baked, the clay is quite brittle, so be careful while handling it, and you can also sand or scrape it to fix some of the details. To seal everything and give a more smooth finish, I airbrushed a generous coat of automotive glossy varnish, then a coat of black and decked them as a zenithal priming. And here are the three figures ready for painting. I'm going to summarize the painting process, because the main focus of this video was the sculpting, and figure painting will be a subject in future videos too. Anyway, I painted the figures with Vallejo acrylics. First, using a base color, applied in diluted layers until I reach the cover that allows me to slightly see the pro-shading made with the zenithal priming. I mixed the base color with off-white to create lighter shades and applied it over light exposed areas, following the shadow and light composition created by the zenithal priming. The gunner's camouflage jacket was painted with the German camouflage beige, medium brown and dark green. After the base pattern was ready, I just painted small dots of the scholars plus light green over the entire jacket. The skin was painted mixing burnt umber, basic skin tone, off-white and scarlet, starting by painting darker tones and moving to lighter ones as I was covering smaller areas, leaving the lighter highlights to a few spots over the nose and the cheeks. I used diluted dark gray, like a wash, to accentuate the shadows on the clothes. For this guy I tried to simulate a sweatshirt by painting darker base colors around the neck, upper portion of the back and armpits. Then I painted some details on the commander's uniform with light gray and red. All painting was done with 000 brushes. As a final touch, I added a LED strip to simulate the binocular strap, painted it with leather brown, and I call it good. So, here they are, the three crew members that are going to be part of the diorama. Each figure took me around 10 hours to complete. I'm sure there is plenty room for improvement yet, but I'm quite satisfied with the result. Even knowing that they are far from the best figures out there, they got a special value for me. So I hope you liked this video, leave a comment if you have any question, hit the like button if you liked the video of course, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!